Well, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Peter Bonfitto. I'm the Gallery Director at the Art Galleries at ACC. Through tonight's conversation, we aim to explore some of the exhibition's themes and get unique perspectives from each artist represented in the exhibition. This exhibition became a wonderful opportunity to invite 3 alumni from our art program back to ACC to exhibit exceptional recent works that demonstrate their high level of technical, intellectual, and conceptual approaches in their artistic practice. So I'm going to start with Laurie, right immediately to my left here. Laurie Frick is a data artist based in Austin, Texas. Through her hand-built artworks, Frick experiments with the consumption of data, providing glimpses into the evolving landscape of technology. Frick holds an MFA from the New York Studio School and an MBA from the University of Southern California. Before applying for her MFA, Frick attended studio art and art history classes at ACC from 2003 to 2005. Heather Parrish, next to Laurie, is a multidisciplinary artist and based in Iowa. In her work, she questions the nature of societal and biological boundaries as productive sites of exchange. She holds an MFA in printmaking from the University of Notre Dame and a BA in kinesiology from the University of Texas at Austin. Before pursuing her MFA, Parrish attended studio art classes at ACC from 2001 to 2011, during which time she focused on printmaking and metal arts. Michael Villarreal is a San Marcos-based visual artist and lecturer at Texas State University. Working from his personal memories, Michael explores notions of self, time, and place. He attended studio art and art history classes at ACC from 2006 to 2010, making him the first in his family to pursue higher education. He holds a BFA from Texas State University and an MFA from the University of Nebraska. So the format for tonight, we're going to have a discussion around the topics, and we selected a few different topics that we wanted to explore. The first one is narrative and process. The second is research and perspective. So now we get to the more fun part, where you guys get to talk. So narrative and process, what story are you telling in your work? And how does your choice of medium communicate ideas or feelings that you want to convey? And so Laurie, kind of taking that a little bit more specific, is how do you use data to create a narrative in your art?
Well, you know, everything's data. It's a thing I've spent thousands and thousands of hours thinking about. All right, let me net it out. I think there's a fundamental human trait that we understand pattern better than anything else. That humans are pattern recognition machines. I think there's an innate ability to be able to create meaning in pattern and to be able to take pattern and understand it in a way that numbers doesn't penetrate our minds in the same way. Pattern has meaning to us as humans. You know, once you take that idea and you say, okay, pattern has meaning, in the next couple days or weeks, you'll start to go, oh, I understand what she means. You just see pattern. That's a basic underpinning, because my belief is that in the future, everything that's collected about you, all the data that's known about us, will eventually end up as art in the spaces that we live, right? So I have this future view of that art will start to be a way to understand ourselves and read ourselves, and art will be, you know, not these rarefied objects on, you know, walls in museums and galleries, but art will be really commonplace. You know, it'll be created by artificial intelligence, and there'll be algorithms, but all our data will start to be these patterns that we get to live and experience. You know, how do you make stories out of data, or how do you make narrative out of data? I kind of come back to this idea that starting to understand, you know, the patterns of how you live your life and what friends you see and where do you go and how do you spend your money and how does your heart rate, you know, change during the day. And that all starts to be patterns that you can start to read about yourself. You know, for this exhibition, I went a little further afield, and we talked about something that was music related. And we collaborated with, there's a composition class, and so one of the students in the composition class had written a piece of music. And I thought that music inherently has a pattern and that music that's interesting and well composed and has sort of a beautiful sense of completeness. There's a repetition, but it's not too boring, right? It has sort of there's an interest, there's a surprise, there's a payoff. That if you created a pattern in that music, you could sense goodness, right? And so the actual musical score, every note is a color, and every beat is a space, and every bar is a piece in the mural. And the music has kind of a dirge quality. It's sort of a slow, and so then you kind of has this slow pacing to the layout. And so in some ways, that mural is exactly like musical notation. You could read it and play it just the way that you could sheet music. It took something that's, I think music is hard to read, and it put it into language that made sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're very well versed in reading music, you can see those patterns, but you're doing something, you're retelling that in a way through the mural and through pattern and shape, color, and making it accessible, but telling it slightly differently, I think.
Right. So if you step back and look at that mural, you can see there's green, and then it's like it goes away, and then it comes back, and there's a variation to it. You go, why is this pattern so interesting? It's because the music's interesting.
I'm going to move to Heather, also thinking about narrative and process. So the works in the exhibition investigate the relationship that Austin has and has had with Waller Creek through multiple generations. So how is this a story that needs to be told?
So just to share, I suppose to share how I came to this question, or kind of focusing on Waller Creek. I think about Waller Creek maybe as a lens or a prism through which to learn about or read, or this history, or a lot of histories kind of converge and then branch out from the history of Waller Creek. Yeah, my family roots are very deep here in Austin. Having grown up, spent a lot of time here during my childhood. I also lived elsewhere, but came back and then made my way to the east side and really loved the cultural vibrance that was there, and just found this like real vitality. And I was there in the kind of 99, early 2000s, and saw this really drastic and rapid transformation happen in the east side. And through my own kind of like, what's happening here, and what just made me curious how, investigating the history of Austin, how it became so segregated, and then how this, but really coming from a place of this next layer of displacement that was happening through development and gentrification of the east side. And somewhere through the multiple conversations of, oh no, what's happening? Someone pointed out to me, I think that, before I-35 was this dividing line, it was Waller Creek. And I was like, really? That's not something that we hear about or learn about very often. And I kind of, through just various channels, my personal journey kind of kept winding across Waller Creek as well. And then I was just really wanted to investigate this placement, and also learning about Austin's earlier history, that there used to be diverse pockets of communities of color across the city, and then it wasn't, and then there was this hard line, so just like, what happened? What's the details? We don't hear or talk about this a whole lot. And I was pointed to a historian named Catherine Pace, got in touch with her, had multiple conversations with her, and then leaned heavily on the articles that she published around Forgetting Waller Creek, and several subsequent ones. It's a story that needs to be told because we need to understand how we got to where we are today in order to be able to see and identify forces that are at work in our communities. And I think the story that Katie tells is focused largely on kind of ecological patterns. So there's this natural cycles of, flash flooding in Central Texas. That's the way of the ecosystem here. And when Austin was built, it just kind of laid this grid right on top of this topography with what seems like disregard for this natural cycle of flooding. And so there's just been this constant tension between flooding and the urban space since then. And it's manifested in different ways. because of that kind of vulnerable territory along the flood zones, vulnerable marginalized communities were forced to settle along that space. So there's this mapping of ecological spaces and societal marginalization. And it was just, I felt like we needed to know more about that history.
The other part of that question is then your telling of it. Because one of the things I think that's really challenging, if you're writing a book or you're writing an article, you can be linear. And you can say, this happened, and then this happened, and you can write a history of that area. But you're doing it through artwork, and you're doing it through an expressive mediums, because you're using printmaking, you're using installation, you're using projection. And so thinking about like that different layers of history and approaching that, because some of your works speak a little bit more to contemporary times, some speak more to historical times, some blend those two.
Right. So I think that printmaking as a medium was a natural method to talk about layers of history. Printmaking is all about layers and layering. And so like the monotype works especially brought in that element of layering and also kind of erasure, rubbing out, reorganizing, recontextualizing. Dealing with this material was a new move for me. This type of material, like really leaning on a very specific history with specific narratives. And a lot of my work previous had been more about an embodied experience and kind of phenomenological, and this trying to bring in a historic, tell a specific history through a language that feels authentic to me was a challenge. And so some of the works deal with it in a more poetic way maybe. And so I also, I went to the archives and I draw a lot on mainly the 1915 flood of Waller Creek, but there were regular flooding that happened. So kind of using that flooding both to bring attention to the history, but also to the kind of metaphorical narrative of the displacement that can happen suddenly, but also kind of this unruliness of the creek under attempts to control it. So kind of holding all of those things or exploring all of those things. So yeah, archival material, photographs. I like collaging, the act of cutting, removing, displacing. That's actually like a physical cut in the pieces, alluding to kind of these poetic or shapes, like just the eyes talking about perspective, vision, trying to draw people to how you look at something changes, what you don't see, what you do see. And then with the installation work is also dealing with those layers through space and then being able to navigate and experience that space from the outside, from the inside, like having an embodied experience.
One of the ways that we've been talking about that is that you're essentially creating your own visual language, like within, it's like a little ecosystem of its own, about Heather Parrish's kind of symbolism and use of the eyes and the colors and just the different things to create this story of retell the story of Waller Creek. I want to move on to Michael. So the body of work featured in the exhibition focuses on your personal environment. So how is the subject of the lawn a method for you to tell the story?
Well, what's in the gallery currently is, I guess it was just like transitional process, and also having an opportunity to work in a lawn. Like I have a lawn now, I've never had a lawn before in my entire life. And so it was something new to me. A lot of this work kind of started back, I guess, during the pandemic. Moved back to Texas, lived with my folks for a little bit, and something that is very important to them is just the cultivation of the space that they're in, their yard, their living, area. And it was always interesting to me. So it's like going in and observing and just like watching them work in this space, put in like the labor. And a lot of times, like, they're kind of making art themselves, right? Like, there's these things kind of like becoming and growing or building, they're like creating sculptures on their own, right? And something that really fascinated me was just like that aspect of it, just being interested in that like sort of those mundane things that just happen, right? I guess like going, into my own space, I had this yard and I started waiting, honestly, like waiting patiently for something to happen. Like this is a space that I'm here, I'm watching it, nobody's like in it, like making anything. And I'm just like waiting for something to happen. And what's happening is like nature's taking over and, things are happening throughout the day, naturally, but there's no intervention, right? And so I wanted to force that intervention, not so much like work in the yard. And I'm not a gardener by any means, you know, or anything like that. But just like the idea of just process and working and just like moving and, you know, I think I found structure in that. And so I started just like, you know, messing around with like, it's like building blocks, right? Like, you know, taking like these simple sculptures that I had and just kind of placing them and arranging them, taking these like gardening rocks that were in the yard and placing them and arranging them, thinking about like my tools as a way to like make drawings as well. And, you know, taking the weed eater and just like start, you know, cutting into the grass and, you know, creating these shapes and patterns, you know, within the grass. And that started to become a structure to me, you know, in terms of how I was interacting with the yard and also how I was interacting with, you know, my hand in it, right? Like there was like intervention, but it was also, you know, over time I, you know, just kind of watch the grass grow, you know, watch the yard kind of do its thing, take over, and just kind of played around with that idea and wanted to represent that in painting. I love painting. So yeah, just kind of go that route, I guess.
So was that independent? Were you, I want to manipulate this piece of earth as a means to create paintings, or were you just doing that more of a sculptural study?
Both ways, I guess, right? I mean, it started out as just like something that happened. So like some of the first paintings I made for this show, helping like my dad kind of place these blocks of like grass, you know, into, you know, the ground and to just kind of fill up the space that was, you know, dead from, you know, summer drought. And then over time, you know, just like keeping an eye on that space, like 6 months later, you know, all the native grass grew and all those patches like died. And that was interesting to me, you know, just that sort of like natural takeover, right? And that just like sparked my curiosity, that little moment, right? And so I wanted to just like relive that, you know, with the blocks too. Like right now I'm like playing with the cinder blocks in a way where I'm trying to create impressions in the ground, you know, so. And this is like through a course of like a few weeks, just like watching and waiting and just seeing, you know, what happens. Like the paintings come quick, but sometimes the process to get to the paintings take a bit of time, you know, because I'm like, not so much watching for the right moment, because I feel like every moment is, you know, there's a possibility. Right now, making like little impressions in the ground, lifting up the bricks, looking at the grass and just seeing, you know, what's happening underneath, putting them back, coming back the next day, interacting with it in that way.
This is printmaking, I have to say.
It is, yeah, no, yeah. That's something I was thinking about the other day. Yeah, I'm like diving into these other means of like, you know, disciplines and making. You know, I'm making land art, I'm making prints. You know.
Well, it's your front yard is an art installation.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, because I love this idea of making art part of everyday life. Mm-hmm. That it doesn't have to be this distant thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, that everybody's space can be artful.
Yeah.
And you played with it.
The playful aspect of art making, yeah.
Yeah, I don't carry a sketchbook anymore, you know. That's my sketchbook at the moment. Right?
Yeah, kind of coming back to you, Laurie, a little bit on your choice of media, having the hand in your work, whether it's hand-dyed wool that you are very meticulously placing. Everyone has always asked, well, why is this one this way and that one that way? People would really try to decode, I think, your work, which I think is intentional play. They're not going to necessarily find the solution, but it's because of those really hand-selected choices that you make.
The thing that initially got me started is when we all first got iPhones and there was this uproar. It's like, oh my God, I'm being tracked. And people were finding every possible way to hide. And I thought, you know what? It's going to go completely upside down. All the data that's collected about us is going to end up being something that you're actually going to want more of your data. And I thought, how do I explain that to people? Right? The data isn't something to be feared, because most people, when I talk about data, I mean, I can watch them recoil. It's just like, ugh. Part of it is I'm trying to make what data can become as appealing and as human and as organic and as some things I make you want to reach out and like lick it, that it's so appealing. It's like, I want that. I'm going as far as I can to make data lovable. I mean, there's a bit of a backlash right now that technology is seen as evil, taking over our lives. It's ruining children. This sense of horribleness of what data and I don't even have to say any more than data. Just data itself is so unloved. I want to take it out of that world of pixels on glass, and take it away from this kind of object and start to think about, well, what if in the future you're not limited? It could be handmade. If you think about material science and bacterial cellulose or this fungus or all these materials that they're working on to be able to build stuff on Mars at a distance, what if you start to imagine that those materials could feel like something that you make? There is kind of a backlash about things that are a little too industrial and a little too perfect. I mean, it's the reason Etsy, right? It's people want the handmade. And so I thought, all right, how do I make data more appealing? How do I make it more handmade? And what if in the future, all this stuff, okay, it might be super high-tech material science, but it's going to look like something that was hand sewn or felt that was cut. I mean, that piece that's made of felt, I actually did it so that it would look like it was like bacteria that was grown.
You had pieces and you cut them?
Yeah.
So
I
the way
dyed
it's
the outside of
dyed-
them, and then I cut them
Right,
so you
there's-
look like it was
yeah.
bacteria. Because I went and visited this DNA lab in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, and they wanted an installation in their lobby, and they thought, we'll trade you for a custom DNA. Anyway, that they can design.
Wait, what did you do?
Some
They could
designer
design-
DNA.
They
trade.
designed DNA. Well, they started doing design DNA for fragrances and flavors, but they now design DNA. But they could design DNA that grows in different colors and literally could grow on the wall based on some kind of pattern. And so that's what the felt was intended to go, well, what if we could grow this?
Well, I'm going to skip to
Yeah.
Heather, because thinking about your collaborations with scientists and with more broadly thinking about research and perspective, and just like, how do you research, and then how has your collaborations with specialists who work outside of the discipline of art shape or impact your work?
I love collaborating because it's extending my own ability to know and learn. Like I don't have to do the hundreds of hours of library research that Katie Pace did to bring this together and make this beautiful kind of historical analysis of Waller Creek, but then I get to use my language to engage with that. And then working with scientists, one of the other projects I'm working on is with a biologist who does DNA analysis, who went to the Gowanus Canal, which is an EPA Superfund site. There's 11 feet of toxic sludge on the bottom of that canal from industrial waste being dumped in there. And so they went with the question, like, is anything alive? And if there is, what's there? And they sampled, and she did the DNA analysis. And not only is there a really lively microbiome, but that microbiome has evolved to break down the toxicity in the canal. So it's this beautiful kind of story of reciprocity and this reciprocal, mutually creative relationship between inhabitant and environment, which is exactly what I'm interested in. And then this like remarkable microbiome. Well, the EPA's process is, they identify a toxic site, dredge it, cap it with concrete, take that unwanted material elsewhere, where I don't know, far away from humans or something. But with this collaborative group, we were really asking, how can we collaborate with our broader multi-species community to create an environment that's mutually lively and thriving for all of us? So we're asking that in a speculative way, as the EPA is currently dredging and concrete capping the Gowanus Canal, but we're still making work celebrating our little neighbors in there.
How do you see your role in that? Like, you're working with people that will have this information again, and then you're coming at it from a visual artist perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all use the tools at our hand, in our visual language. And I've used kind of experimental photography, working in layers, kind of investigating that site. And we've done cyanotypes, which are, making images out of light and water. And that's also something I did with the Waller project. We've collected that sludge, and it's grown into these gorgeous and crazy, little spheres of life, and to kind of make accessible to people, the amount of life and how dynamic it is and how beautiful, and then taken close-up photographs and blown them up huge. Just to kind of mess with the sense of scale and time to make it accessible. So material, time, scale, visual experience, space, kind of taking it into that. Yeah, I love collaborating.
Yeah, and we'll continue along that thread, I think, a little bit as we go. But I want to go back to Michael a little bit. You talked about this a little bit already. I kind of want to hone it going back to the it's up there right now, the cinder blocks, and talking about that as part of the process and how your sculptural work dovetails with these paintings in particular. And so that you're building material, you're kind of doing research in a kind of physical or almost mechanical way, and how that impacts the paintings.
I mean, a lot of the sculptures I've used in these paintings, they're kind of on hand, right? A lot of sculptures were, I guess were once owned, right? The way I kind of think about my sculptures is like, they're these like objects that I accumulate over time, and they have a specific life, and then that life kind of changes as years go on. And a lot of that goes back to my parents. Like they worked at U-Haul for their entire lives, and so a lot of things that we kind of accumulated, over time when we were younger was like a lot of used objects, things that came out of like abandoned storage units and stuff like that. And I don't know, the idea of just like reusing them kind of makes there's something a lot more solid in that. Like taking them. They were once these things that were just like sculptures on their own for installation purposes or for just showing purposes. Now they're being used for, purposes of like this process. And also, how far can I take them, right? Like how far can they be used? And just leaving some of these things outside. And it's not just the cinder blocks themselves. Like I want to bring more of these objects outside and just kind of like, interact with them and just kind of see how, they function or how they interact with the space that I'm working in. And also these objects are, over time, like take effect from the elements outside too, which I'm thinking it's like super interesting as well, And so in a sense, like they're actually like leading to an end, they're gonna fall apart eventually. And I find that pretty fascinating. And it makes me want to like capture something like that, even more as well in the ways that I'm like kind of using them and working with them within this backyard space. But in terms of that piece there, I mean, the cinder blocks have like a bit of a meaning for myself, in a more personal lens. These were a foundation to the home, I did grow up in. The piece Groundwork kind of references that kind of start of like building and building a structure and building a space, but it's not there yet, right?
It's potential in some
ways.
It's
potential.
There's so many through lines with all of your work, but this idea of collecting is really important. You're all collecting. You're probably spending maybe as much time collecting different things as you are making art, making work. There's like so much thought that goes into that part of the process, and that kind of contemplative intentionality in all of your work that I think is really very, very strong. So once it's kind of going back to you, Laurie, kind of like there's so much data, like how do you decide this is what I'm going to focus on? Because it could be absolute infinite possibilities. And so how do you get to something you're like, okay, now I'm going to spend X amount of hours, thousands of hours now working on this one thing?
I was a artist in residence at Samsung at their R&D lab for their mobile phones. And one of the things, they can identify who you are just by the way that you pick up and interact with your phone. The idea that it needs to take a picture or a thumb or have a passcode to get in is complete theater. There's data about you that's specific to you, that's known, that's tracked, that's understandable. I really like data that's personal. I'm not looking for data that's like historical track. I like individual human data, individual personal data, that it has this insight about you. I've done a lot of work with location data, and people will say, oh, my life is really boring. I just go, home and to work. But if you really track where you go, I think it's a lot like an abstract expressionist painting. You get these really intense areas that you go frequently over and over and over. And then every now and then you go to a party and you go to Home Depot and the grocery store, but then you go back to the stuff that you go over and over and over. And when you really think about it, it's like a painting. If you think about where you travel and where you go, that there's a story about you. And that kind of data is really interesting to me, particularly data that's unconscious. Things like how you spend your time. It's almost like a neural Fibonacci. There's proportions of how your attention span shifts, and the proportions of that timing has a sense of self, has a sense of who you are and how you operate in the world. When you go from one task to the next task to the next task, How do you spend your time? Do you always get up at the same time every day? Those kinds of patterns that are not deliberate, that are unconscious ways to see yourself. So I hunt for data sets that are like that. And it turns out that there's these huge data sets that are collected every year of how exactly, there's 60,000 people that get interviewed. How did they exactly spend their time over the last 24 hours? Every country in the world does time studies. So if once you start wanting, you can go find.
Right.
The piece upstairs in Felt is based on an OkCupid data set. These two Danish researchers scraped the site and collected all the data about how people answered questions on OkCupid. So once you start looking, you can find great stuff.
Well, my follow-up to that is do you see yourself in that? And how is your relationship as both maker of the work, but then also potentially subject?
There's the theory that every artist is always making self-portraits. Every bit of art is self-portraiture. So how you choose and what interests you and what compels you. But I also collected a huge amount of data about me for years. I tracked all of my sleep data. I had all my location data, what time I woke up in the morning, and I put it all on this massive spreadsheet. And there's a company in Austin called data.world. It's like a social media site for data people. So I took all of my data and uploaded it. So it's all there. And so every time somebody bookmarks it or grabs it or downloads it, I get a notice. And I'm kind of secretly thrilled by this. Early on, there was this one guy I found that had tracked all of his time every day, and he put it in an HTML file, a graphic file, 24 hours, and it's down to the last few minutes, got up, brushed teeth, literally went to the bathroom, He kept track of his time for years. And I was so amazed when I found this because it looked like the same way that I'd been tracking time. So just find somebody else that's doing it in the same way. And I met him, Ben Lipkowitz. If you actually go look, phonetic.net, all of it's online, still out there. His parents were like neuroscientists. He believed, and this is a while ago, that the more data that he captured about himself, he was creating the ability for basically an AI to anticipate it and carry him into the future. And now you go, oh yeah. So data can not just define who you are, it can project you long after you're gone.
It's anticipating.
It's anticipating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A similar question to you, Heather, thinking about going back to Waller Creek a little bit and history, and then seeing yourself as someone that has can trace her heritage generations back through the city to the city's founding. How do you see yourself in your work?
I mean, I think the work is the manifestation of my own trying to uncover this history and then trying to translate it in a way that's meaningful to me, I guess, but also like a service to the community, feeling responsible to this history as a person who family heritage, the same kind of history that unfolded in Austin unfolded all over the country, where there were, I think we know some about the interstate system as well, was planned and designed to separate communities and to displace specific communities. And through urban design and planning, and then the settlement of vulnerable flood zones and vulnerable populations, mapping those onto each other, the displacement of populations through park creation, like these kind of strategies were used all over the country. So in a way, like investigating a very specific place's history also speaks to this ubiquitous history across the United States. And I've lived in a lot of places other than Austin as an adult, but this is my town and this is the history that I'm responsible to, as this is where my roots are. So I think that's where, there's aesthetic things, like, oh, this is like, the blue, soft, watery, like those are all things that I like. But in terms of the project, yeah, it's more of something I feel responsible to rather than something that I see myself in necessarily. But I'm integrated and entangled with all of this, knowing the specific histories of my family. I'm not, there's more mysteries to be uncovered. More histories to be learned. I really wanted this broad historical lens and connecting these two displacements. And then it turned out to be more layers of displacement the longer that I got into it. And yeah, I just felt like it was important for me to make visible.
We've talked about the idea of activism a little bit over the course of this exhibition, planning of it. Is that something else that you want other people to feel, that this is also their city and that they have a responsibility? Or is it go outside of you, or is
Absolutely. I mean, I think maybe generally bringing awareness and consciousness to the invisible forces that are at work, whether they be ecological or municipal or darker histories of racism and the ways that power is channeled and the ways that money is served, and how all of those things are entangled with one another. That's definitely something that I want to bring consciousness about. And I think as I try to bring these visibility to kind of stimulate people to think critically about when they hear about a beautification project. What's that beautifying? You know, who beautiful to who? Wanting to bring more critical awareness. I mean, we think about activists kind of as holding picket signs in red and black and bold. And I come with a really different voice and temperament, but I do believe the types of voices and are needed to create change and to create awareness.
Michael, thinking about, we've obviously talked about this quite a bit already, but just kind of really put a little bit more of a finer point on it, like where do you see yourself within those paintings in general, and then maybe your larger body of work?
You know, the work manifests just through like just my own history, right? You know, I think that's like the biggest relationship with the work. The pieces I've made in the past were a little bit more direct in terms of story and how they were developed. And this, you know, I think the work's become a bit more, maybe a little bit more ambiguous. I mean, I have like, you know, specific reasons why I want to like, you know, make a pattern, make a simple structure, right? You know, put my own like sort of interpretation as to like, you know, those reasons. And the way I'm making these pieces makes me feel grounded in their outcome, right? Now, I'm always striving to like make a piece that like surprises me. And I think a lot of that comes with being in the process and just being in it. In that, I tend to become the work too, because when I leave my studio, I'm just like a painting in itself, you know? But then there's also just like the physicality of it, you know, working the paintings and building these layers, you know, physically just seeing myself in it. I think there's a lot of that going on, pushing, pulling, scraping, applying, lifting up paint that fell on the floor and putting it back on, you know? And just the overall just interaction with the creation of these like compositions, you know, as well, just being present all the time and just like building a routine and like going outside and just making sure I'm not missing something and just like kind of making it part of my everyday.
One of the things that just on an aesthetic level and conceptual as well as the underpainting in your works and specifically in these works, we love it. We've enjoyed it so much. It just makes it kind of radiates kind of from underneath.
Yeah, I think of the underpaintings as like specific times of day, you know, and I try to find a palette, a transitional palette of color. Now, one way I do that is just like, I think of like sunsets and sunrises, you know, and that's how I kind of talk about time within the work, you know, and it's not so much just that talks about time. I think it's also just the story of like mark making. Like, you know, the works are so physical in a sense, like you see the beginnings of the paintings and you see the end of the painting, right? They tend to tell a story of their own, just on the surface. I mean, personally, that's something like I really love and I enjoy about the works themselves. It's just like, I mean, for me too, like just the overall process and the end results, like I'm constantly coming back to the paintings and seeing something new myself, you know, something I didn't notice before. I try not to be so formulaic with the work, you know, and their creations, right? I could recreate one of those paintings again, it would be totally different. Yeah, big interest in.
That's one thing that all of you demonstrate just through those works, and is just this high level of control, just meticulous care. And so like thinking about the underpainting, it would be so easy to cover that up. You're restricting yourself from doing that. And, you know, Heather, obviously you're doing a lot of that with the printmaking, and Laurie, of course, you're doing that with hand, yes. Kind of continuing with this idea of labor intensiveness of the works, and like go to you, Heather, the time spent making the work, how does that relate to the concepts within the work?
Well, there's a few pieces, the monotypes that I started in 2016 at a residency dealing with borders, and the topic that I wanted to explore was the border of Waller Creek and these two histories of displacement. So the original set of prints that I came out of that, I was just really unsatisfied with how the disconnect between the final prints and then the ideas that I wanted to explore and then how they materialized. I just felt like it wasn't happening yet. So I percolated on this and then found Katie Pace's research and then continued. So there was a lot of time. I did it very quickly, but and sat with it and then tried a million kind of ideas on in my studio. And then the thing that resolved it was just making the rubbing of renewal through the middle of it, to me, like kind of brought it all back together. And so it ended up being like a fairly simple and very subtle move, but it took like years to figure out what that last thing was. Also, like not abandoning it, being kind of pricked by this, like I know I really need and want to make work about this subject matter, and just it took time to figure out how to do that. This is not your question, but this is something I wanted to share out loud, was the materials for the installation that I found were, and you're talking about how we accumulate or gather things. So for me, there's like significance or meaning within the materials. The paper that the cyanotypes are made on is called mending tissue. It was handmade in Iowa, and it was actually broken mending tissue. So I felt like making work about this kind of broken history of our city on mending tissue was important. And then the grid pattern that was cyanotyped on top of it was used with a fabric that's for soil retention, flood mitigation material fabric. You know, so again, that like conceptually the material used was important. That doesn't answer your question, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, no, it's important because the materials themselves are almost work, kind of a tension with the materials where they've been kind of worn or used, or again, kind of
translated.
Michael's work also like the potential for it to be used.
I think people can see that even if they can't articulate it. But I'm also a believer in the sublime, that idea that if you put love and time into a work as you paint it and as you create it, it comes back to the viewer. That which you put in comes back. Sometimes you can see it in something that's labor intensive, but if you put your intention, literally put love into the work, it comes back.
Thinking about your work and specifically the works in the exhibition and how they might relate to influences you have from other artists or placing it in other contexts. So is there anything external that kind of helped you make these works outside of the materials, outside of the research that we've talked about that you do, but just another kind of influence that helped shape the work?
Ellsworth Kelly. You can go see Ellsworth Kelly right at UT.
I often like say this name, and there's often like different reactions to it. It's Sean Scully, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I've often been fascinated by just the simple grid compositions that he's made, but also his way of observing too, right? Like his environments or the places that he's at the moment, you know, and the way he interprets this, like sunlight maybe, or shifts of days or seasons in color.
His work was landscape. He was painting the landscape. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I totally see that.
I think, he's been definitely an influence in my work. And a lot of his work you can see at the Fort Worth Modern, if I'm not mistaken. They might still be up. I know they were holding down a gallery for the longest time, you know, but yeah.
I don't have a very direct answer to this question, but I kind of want to go by way of kind of responding to something Laurie was talking about a minute ago with the perceptual abilities that we have that we can't necessarily name, you know, so there's something invisible but totally palpable when you encounter a work of art. You can tell how honest the artist was being, or how, I don't know, there's something about what was put in and what's received that goes beyond just the physicality of the piece and this kind of sense of embodied perception. James Turrell is somebody that's been really important to me, I think. I don't know that I would say that that's his direct influence for this particular work, but in work around perception.
But his sincerity. Right.
I think that's a good place to turn to the question sections.
I'll start with one. My name is Perry Crafton. I'm the Dean of the Arts and Digital Media Division. And because you are all alums of the college, I want to kick it off by asking if there is a specific memory or something that happened while you were here at ACC that maybe you discovered about yourself as an artist that influences you in your art, something maybe significant that ACC has about your works.
I had a prior life in tech, and when I came to ACC, I knew nothing. And I can't even tell you how patient and helpful, I mean, patient times 10, the art faculty was with me. And you have this fear when you start. It's like, oh, I'm just going to embarrass myself. And I have to say the generosity and I mean, I took art history and I took Photoshop and I took drawing and ceramics. I mean, I did full time for almost 2 years and took just a ton of art classes. And it was the work that got me to the point where I could apply and get into an MFA program. I mean, it was no kidding, but I knew nothing.
Big memory for me is being enrolled in a painting class, realizing that the way that I paint was okay, you know, like it was
Life affirming.
Yeah. It was just like the energy of the professor that I had, right? Letting me know that these like heavy marks that I'm making are doing what they need to do, right? You know, it's creating the image. You're pretty much like sculpting, you know, an image out of like brushwork, right? There was one critique where, you know, she pointed something out in the painting, and it was this mark moving through another mark just with confidence and plowed through it. And she kind of made a comment about football, but she didn't really understand anything about football, but it just made her feel like, you know, it was just like this brushwork, like tackling the other, you know, and, I don't know.
It was the physicality.
Yeah, the physicality, yeah. Yeah, and that was a fun class. And I guess just like my pursuit in surface quality in the paintings, you know, is just a gradual, you know, pursuit in refining and working with it and leading it to what, you know, you're seeing in the space upstairs.
Yeah, I had a lot. I mean, so many things are coming to mind.
You went here for how long?
I went forever. I don't know, it was like 10 years or something. It seemed like I was. So thank you. It was affordable. I could pay out of pocket. And like I could actually, you know, get the education that I wanted and needed here. I mean, a really important moment was I was doing metal work and sculpture, very like ceramics. I was very into sculptural materials. And then I took a printmaking class. And the first monotype that I pulled off, my very first print ever, it was like, I'm gonna be doing this the rest of my life. It wasn't like love at first sight, it was like marriage at first sight, you know, just like, I'm gonna be doing this forever, I'm totally hooked. And then several semesters later of taking, Terry Goodhue was my printmaking teacher, and you know, she's like, I think you might be a printmaker. And I was like, oh, I'm not anal enough with my, you know, I'm too loose and expressive and spontaneous. And you know, she was like, no, it takes both kinds. You got to be able to pay attention, and you also have to be really open to experiments and to the happy accidents. And so, you know, just having that, you know, like she called it in a way. I do a lot of work, but I have landed in, my professional trajectory has followed along with printmaking. And yeah, that I discovered here.
What role does scale and using identically sized canvases play in your work?
I guess it goes back to that just idea of finding structure, right? I'm making these sort of like motifs, patterns, like with objects in the paintings themselves, and I'm just kind of repeating that with the size, you know, canvas that the paintings are painting on, and just keeping them all the same size. And I think I find myself, you know, often challenging myself to like make the perfect canvas, you know? Like I build my own canvas structure, like the stretcher, I stretch my own canvas, and I love that part of the process, you know. It's kind of like, you know, working with these objects physically, you know, it's that physical interaction that I love. And it's just kind of meditative as well, you know, when doing these different tasks to create this structure. I don't know, I guess size-wise, 50 by 50 inches, I don't know, I don't see that often. Also, you know, I didn't have like a specific reason why they are 50 by 50 inches. I just knew I wanted them to be 50 by 50 inches. You know, teaching painting, you see all these like standard size canvases all the time, right? It's just like, yeah, I don't want my paintings to just feel like every other painting. Right. You know, it's made by me specifically, you know, a specific size of my choice. And
You're the metric system.
Yeah.
50 by 50.
But you don't always work in that.
In that scale?
Yeah, but for the or
for these,
like
I wanted it to be specific for this. Yeah, I don't always work in that scale. It ranges, you know, in a variety of sizes for sure. And often I go back to smaller work every once in a while just to see the difference in mark making, you know, like I get a little, like works, the paint becomes more physical in a smaller scale painting, you know, and a lot of times, you know, it's like a study to like how I might want to approach a bigger painting, like how do I represent this mark on a larger scale, right? You know, if I wanted to up the scale of the smaller painting that I'm making too, kind of thinking about that as I'm like working through these pieces.
I think this is probably for both of you, obviously very different ways to answer it, but how do you work with the architecture in the installation of your work?
I build little foam core models of every gallery that I show in, and that's one of my favorite parts of preparation for the exhibition is building. And I have a mini projector, and I've got I do my little mini thing. Yes, it's very site responsive, but yeah, I love building my little models and then playing around with my materials and how it will engage.
If you're looking at a painting on the wall and it's bigger than you, then there's this idea that you then step into the work. So it pulls you in. And so when I've got a chance to make something big, it's like, yay, absolutely. Well, because it pulls you in.
Yeah, we talked about that. We want to make it as high as possible.
I
Up to
did,
the
yeah.
ceiling.
Yeah, we wanted to make it as big as we possibly could.
Hello. I was just wondering, how often have y'all been able to lose yourselves in the work? Has there been like a specific moment where all you felt was right?
Every day, all the time. Yeah, you're in the
Was it
studio.
a specific feeling?
Yeah, where I just let go. I don't remember anything. It's really hard as an artist to have something on your schedule because you lose not just sense of time, you have the sense that time even exists. You can't remember anything.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, you understand.
Yeah, totally. That's
It's not like you lose track of time.
Yeah.
There is no time.
yeah, it's the flow, and that's the goal.
I have two questions. The first one for Laurie. My dad's a big tech guy, and we often have this argument about AI and art. I think AI intervening in art is kind of a ridiculous regurgitation, and he thinks that it makes art more accessible for people who aren't art-minded. As you were talking about data, it made me think about what's really the difference between data that's scary and data that isn't. And I came up with consent. When I look at my smartwatch or I look at Spotify Rap just came out, I know how many minutes of music I listen to. I know all the genres, my top artists. I think the idea of informed consent is really important with technology. And what scares people is the fact that they don't know where their data is going. How do you feel about that?
I have told people that owning your data is going to be more important than privacy. And so the idea that you not only know what's tracked, but what's tracked about you is owned by you. And given talks, I press this as much as I possibly can. If you could see what was tracked about you, you'd not only understand yourself better, but you'd have control over what is captured about you. Because right now, the idea of consent is now it's this other parental entity that still gets to track you. So I'm a big proponent. Sometime in the future, somewhere along the line, there'll be some set of new rules, and the rules will be the data that's collected about you is owned by you. Maybe it's co-owned by you, but you own it. Anyway, but your dad with the AI, I'm on his side.
That's all right. That's all right.
Tell him, hey, I found this artist. She agrees with you.
Was it even useful for you to go all that way? Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And then just to be fair, Heather, I'm not born in Austin, but I'm from Texas, and I've done all my schooling here. And your conversation about home and place, and Michael talking about moving often and the cinder blocks representing a home or having a lawn, which you never had previously, made me think a lot about home and the sense of change, especially in a physical location like Waller Creek that's subject to things that it feels like completely out of your personal control. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you deal with the consistency of change in a way that feels like it's out of your control?
I think that's really hard part about being an Austinite right now is the rate of change is traumatic almost, and how do you deal with it? How do you find your little patch, like maybe your backyard patch that doesn't change or that the change that happens there feels like something that connects you to it instead of disconnects you from it. I think leaving Austin and coming back regularly and finding sites that are like, oh, that's not there anymore. That's not there anymore, But then there are little pockets that are the same, that are grounding. It's a hard question. I mean, I'm making work about it now in a way. I think artists have the advantage that we can materialize things and memorialize things. Right. And, you can make paintings, pictures, sculptures about those things that keep you connected to them. And then, finding your little nooks that developers don't want yet and then enjoying them and watching the native grasses grow there and inviting your multi-species friends to hang out there. I don't know. There's not an easy answer. It's hard. Breathe about it. Get flexible. Yeah.
Heather,
Since working for the exhibition, I feel like every time I hear Waller, my ears just prick up. And as a native Austinite, this has really changed my day-to-day relationship with the physical landscape. The things that I notice about whenever I see a historical plaque, it's a 1883. Oh, that was prior to the, movement of all of these freedmen's homes, so on and so forth. Do you feel this day to day?
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe kind of a reverse engineer to that. Like, as I was doing this research and learning about specific sites along Waller, I realized my own personal intersections with these corners and spaces. Like, I did some metal work in Waller Creek Bar, or it's a bar that's not open now, but I was at the corner of Sabine and 6th Street, and it overlooks Waller, and I had done a lot of work there. One of my first studio jobs was for an artist named Reggie Thomas, who was doing a big mural on Waller Street, and so that was the Waller project that was like ingrained into my brain for 10 months that I lived, ate, and slept. And I kind of didn't realize that until later, that Waller's name was all over the place, and learning that Edwin Waller was the first city planner, and he was a whole hot mess in a lot of ways, and things kind of came to light as I was doing this research and just realizing my own, like how it was kind of embedded in my own journey in these like multiple ways and intersections. And then there are lots of elements about how I look at parks and parkways differently after this research. I think about flood insurance in a different way. And, seeing a space, a natural waterway that's been engineered, and thinking about why has it been engineered that way, who's welcome there and who's not welcome there, and those kind of things,
Just thinking about the Austin urban environment as a reflection of other major cities that have experienced this sort of residential hypersegregation, such as, Baltimore. It's very interesting to me, the juxtaposition between the built environment and the natural environment, and who is privileged to live in which one. And in which context. I really appreciate that your work covers this to such a great effect. Do you have any personal stance as to how you believe we should be responding to this sort of gentrification, especially in East Austin?
I'm responding in my way right now, making art about it and trying to bring it into public knowledge and discourse and conversation. But it's really hard to feel anything but disempowered in the face of developers and economic interests. But getting involved in your city government in whatever ways that you can.
The neighborhood associations have a great deal of power. I mean, they've changed things in Zilker Park. They have more influence than you'd know. And the neighborhood associations, it's not elected. It's just neighbors that come together and have a voice.
Yeah, civic engagement, really important.
Okay. All right, really we're going to wrap up, and I want to thank all of our guests again.